What's up, guys? Welcome to the Goose Knob Show. So, I have an idea I want to explore a little bit that, well, it's a prediction about the future, and it is a kind of an analysis of a social system that I think we've taken for granted. And ultimately, I think this is an explanation I have never heard before of or a cause of the population collapse. And it's a hypothesis, so it needs more evidence, but I think that it might be right, actually. Okay, so let's get into it. So, for all of human history, families had children because children were free labor for the families. You had a kid, it took them a few years to kind of grow up, but once they were, once they could, listen to directions and follow orders and do some basic work, all of your kids would be working. And you have to understand, for most of humanity's history, for all of humanity's history, people have been basically starving. Starving was the norm. And misery was the norm. And everyone was, barely hanging on. Everyone was barely hanging on. It's like people who are, in absolute poverty today. We say, oh, look at the people in, Africa and India. Things, they have it so bad. It's like everyone was like that, just a few hundred years ago. Like 200, 300 years ago. Everyone was making, just dollars in a month. I think this was like $1.50 a day. That's what most people lived on for hundreds of years. Now, you could say, okay, there was, hunger was a thing and there was problems. But I'd also say that, people weren't dying. The population wasn't, people were dying, but people weren't, just like everyone didn't just die in a generation. It was somewhat sustainable and it worked. And I think it's because people had to adopt systems that worked or else they would have died. It was a very evolutionary pressures, I think, were extremely, here's a theorem. Evolutionary pressures are extremely strong in the absence of technological cushioning and material wealth. So if you were doing something wrong, if your belief system was wrong, it probably would have died out. So, people had somewhat functional beliefs or actions rather. Their entire philosophies probably weren't, great. But, the way that they lived, it had to work or else they would have died. That's my point. So in this kind of system, where you're only making a few dollars in a year, you can't buy groceries in that system. People were subsistence farmers. People had to grow their own food for the most part, or communities had to grow food, and it was it's not exactly the system we had today. And you could say, well, how would today? It's like almost unthinkable for like someone to grow their food. It's like, oh, it's so much work. It's impossible to do all this. It's like, how would I do this all? It's like I have a job. I have to do this. It's like, this is why most people, they aren't subsistence farmers. They buy groceries because groceries are a more efficient use of, labor in the current technologically advanced system. And fair enough. But anyway, let's go back. Most of human history, you had families, not just keeping their children on the side, not just saying, oh, these children will just, oh gosh. Everyone had a job. Everyone had to pull their own weight. Everyone had to contribute. And if you didn't contribute, your family is probably going to be even more poor than absolutely poor. And, that probably would have meant that, it's more likely everyone's going to die. So, anyway, in these conditions, everyone had to work. And it's a system, I'd say, that worked, because if you look at the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s, the 1500s, like, look at the types of people, at least in Europe. Look at the types of people who emerged in that society. Read the literature, European literature in the 1800s. Read European literature in the 1700s. It's highly advanced. It's highly advanced. These people were geniuses. They were inventing insanely, this is the Industrial Revolution. People who were living as basically subsistence farmers or having, their children work, they have probably pushed humanity forward more than any group of people ever in human civilization. So, anyway, my point is, and the point is there, they had an education system that worked. It didn't look exactly like what we have now, but it was a system that, basically did its job, more or less, even though the children were probably, helping out with their parents. So, and I think this is actually why we have summer breaks. I think it's because, during the summer, kids were supposed to help their parents out, reap the harvest, something like that. Anyway. So let's continue here. Let's continue. So in that time, children helped out their families, and children remained educated. Now, what happened is, as we industrialized and as we, developed more advanced technologies, that also required more intelligence to run, which also had a lot more danger associated with them, right? Humanity, or at least the West, we basically were like, oh yeah, the system we used to be living in, where we, our children were working for us, we'll just apply this to this modern industrial setting, which is why you had, child labor in factories. And the problem is, children in factories, I don't think that they're fully equipped mentally to adopt the responsibility required to operate, advanced and complicated mechanical systems, which is why, as a society, we said, okay, no, we can't have children work in factories. We can't, have child labor like this, right? And I think society basically, rebounded in, the exact opposite direction and kind of lost everything. They said, oh, I think they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater here. And I think the entire world essentially did this. And I think this is the commonality that we see throughout, I think, all industrialized nations. Industrialized nations, learning from, maybe the mistake of child labor in factories of the 1800s and early 20th century, they've said, oh, we're not going to have child labor either. And what I think happened is, well, let's get into it. So, in a society where children work for you, right? You have children not because you're trying to, satisfy some biological need. You're not having children to say, just for the heck of it. You're not having children, because you want to, only because you want to, like, how would you say it? Spread your genetic lineage, although that is a part of it, But you're having children maybe primarily on the economic front because they will make your life easier, because they will work for you and they're free labor, and you can, instead of paying someone $1 a day or something, or instead of paying, someone a wage, you have free labor for you that will work for you because, one, it's teaching them how to be responsible. Two, it's giving them real world experience, And three, maybe it's making them money, or it's making their life easier because, it's not all on your shoulders. So anyway, I'd say that you could argue that there's, the reason why people have kids is, biological and this and da 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 da. And yes, that is true, but I don't, even the strong urges of biological nature, I'd say are, how would you say it? Are not enough. If it comes down to, you having, your decision to be having kids just being a, one on your basically your feelings and your instincts, I think that empirically we can see today, the way our society is going, people will not see their instincts and their feelings as a strong enough reason to have kids. And if you guys are aware of the demographic transition model, I mean, we all learned it in school. I mean, I think this might be one of the reasons why pretty consistently you see birth rates drop in all industrialized countries. Because, one, in an industrialized country, the education of each individual member of the populace arguably has to be higher, right? So more emphasis is placed on education, which means in your child years, instead of, working, you're going to be learning in school or whatever. So that's one thing. The other thing is children are no longer going to be working because, factories where most of the labor is being done in a modern society, factories are, rough industrial factories are not going to be safe for kids. And I think because of that, because of these reasons, the majority of people inside of a population say essentially, there's not really, the reason for me to have kids is pretty shallow. There's not really doesn't really make much sense to me. It's just maybe there's a religious reason, maybe, God says we need to have more kids, but I don't know about that. Maybe there's maybe I like having sex. No, that's what will lead me to have a lot of kids. I mean, that does it for a lot of people. For a lot of people, it doesn't, I guess. And especially with the advent of contraceptives, like that's kind of something that's more or less out the window. So I mean, the reasons for having kids, it's kind of shallow right now. In the short term, and I think people make economic decisions, and kids are an economic decision, at least on some level. People make economic decisions not only, for long-term things, they make them for short-term things as well. It's got to work for you in the short term and the long term, So anyway, I mean, you get the point. People aren't having kids because the economics in the current system doesn't work out. And I guess the thing is, I've heard a lot of people have said the real reason people aren't having kids. The real reason people aren't having kids is because the Malthusian doomsday environmentalists have been preaching for years that, if having kids is the worst thing you can do for the environment. If you have kids, you're killing the planet, blah, 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 a bunch of dumb, stupid, nonsense that, those professors should be ashamed of themselves. But granted, I'd say that has had an effect to an extent. But I'd say that still the primary mover in this causal chain of why the population is currently collapsing is probably due to economics. I think it's due to economics. Now, what I would also say is that there are a number of interesting, specific I guess, scenarios in many different countries wherein there are other factors involved that are having kids, making people not want to have kids as much. So in the West, obviously, the Malthusian environmentalist doomsdayers, they've basically seized control of the reins of the current narrative and the current power structure. And, most people kind of buy into that apocalyptic narrative of the environmentalists. And in that set of values and in that belief is encoded the idea that you shouldn't have kids, or you should be, sustainable, quote unquote, whatever that means. And, most people feel like, oh, you know what, if I have less kids or if I have no kids, that's the best thing I can do morally. Right. So I'd say that definitely has an effect, and probably a pretty strong effect. In China, you have the one-child policy. In Japan, I'd say that, there's actually, I heard an argument once for why their population collapsed, but I'm kind of forgetting it. But I don't know. I feel like their family structure is a little screwy at some level. I think from what I understand about Japanese family structure, I think the father isn't really in the picture much, and I don't know. It just seems like, I don't know. It seems like kind of a cold system that they have. In the modern day, I don't think that it was always like this, but in the modern day, especially, people are, maybe, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know enough to kind of speak on this educationally, or not educationally. I don't know, with some degree of certainty, I'd say. But what I can say is what I've seen from Japanese culture and media and all this other stuff over the course of, a few decades, is a constant theme within Japan has been the idea that they're living in, their own little simulated realities and simulated bubbles, which is true. And if you've been to Japan, I haven't, but some of my friends have been, and they've relayed stories of what it was like there. And essentially it's like hyper capitalist and very everything's in a simulation. Everyone's kind of living in their own little bubbles, and it's all kind of about entertainment and fun. And people work on their jobs to get back to what little hobbies they have, I think. So anyway, and a lot of Japanese anime kind of touches on the idea that, living in a simulation is bad. And I think, well, Evangelion, for example, that's one of the main themes of that series. And anyway, so I think, maybe the fact that the Japanese people, for the most part, live in very simulated, very kind of artificial environments where, maybe the real world doesn't matter as much as the simulated world. Maybe that has an effect on why, why they haven't had they don't have very high birth rates, and their population collapsed first, because, if I could indulge, as a man, I could indulge in let's say a perfect looking woman, that's been the all the parameters that make this woman beautiful have been ideally tuned to what I like, in the form of like an anime girl or whatever. And you completely buy into that, then I guess the sexual side of what you want, maybe that's kind of satisfied, because, that's been, you have a very good simulated version of that. And, gosh, what's with body pillows? What's with waifus? What's with all this, simulated romantic stuff? I'd say that definitely seems to me it's an indicative of where, I mean, a lot of people in that culture have kind of, how would you say it? I don't know. Maybe one of the reasons why a lot of people have maybe checked out of the sexual marketplace. Potentially. I don't know. Maybe this is speculation, blah, 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 whatever. But it seems like this at least has some part to do with the population collapse in Japan, at least to some level. Who knows? But, and maybe I'm completely wrong, but who knows? I'm just trying to come up with a working, model of what we're going through, so we can predict into the future of what's going to happen. So anyway, my point with all this is, there are, maybe region specific or area specific, factors that have also been causing a downfall of childbirth, right? I mean, so you got region-specific stuff. You have the prevalence of contraceptives. You have, the lack of an economic reason for children. You have maybe environmentalism. Maybe that's a global thing. Who knows? I don't know if China and Japan buy it as much as we do, but Japan does, I think. You had the Kyoto Protocol and all that stuff, but China, maybe I don't know. So anyway, the point is, there's some factors, but I think maybe the primary factor for the lack, the population collapse could potentially just be due to the economics of it. So let's go into the economics of it. So if you're going to have a kid, in the modern day, you are going to essentially send them to a school for that's not even 8 years, it's 12 years. You're going to send them to school for 12 years, and then maybe you're going to pay for their college. And then maybe you're going to pay for something more. And then maybe you got to keep them in your house and blah, blah, blah. So, at the very minimum, you're paying for another mouth to feed. And then you're paying for all the materials they need. And then you're paying for the time logistics of how to deal with them and blah, 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 blah. Especially the time logistics, right? The problem with the time logistics is we live like 50 years ago. Parents did not care what their kids were doing. They'd say, okay, you go out in the neighborhood, you have fun, just be back before dark. In the modern day, you can't do that. In the West, you can't do that. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but essentially our communities in the West have basically collapsed, or at least white people's communities. And, the result is, I think, kids can't just go around and roam around and play. And it's also kind of hard for kids to find friends in their neighborhood because the average age of people, it's not young anymore. It used to be, the average age was like really young, but now it's like in the 40s or something like that. So it's like the likelihood like a kid is going to just stumble upon another kid in their neighborhood is actually a lot smaller than it would have been, in the 1940s or 30s or whatever. So that means that parents not only have the responsibility of monetarily supporting one kid, they also have the responsibility of temporally supporting their kid. They have to, and this is why schools stay in for so long. It's because they want to, it's basically daycare for kids. So the parents don't need to spend as much time taking care of them. And this wouldn't be really a problem, right? It wouldn't be a problem if parents needed to take care of their kids and spend some time on them. If you had one parent spending time on the kid and the other parent getting money. But what you have is most parents are just both working. And if you're both working, how are you going to find the time to work on a kid too? So the time doesn't really make much sense. The time doesn't make much sense. The money doesn't make much sense. You're just basically paying more taxes, and the time, money, effort, energy, all this other stuff, you have to stress about them. You have to worry. So anyway, there's a lot of costs that are associated with these kids, and none of them, there's like very few rewards that you really get from them. Maybe you feel happier that you have kids. Maybe, you look at your kid, gosh, you go through a very complicated, emotional transformation when you have kids for most people. I have no clue what that's like, but I've heard it's extremely powerful. So maybe that, that's like some, bump of cocaine that, makes you ride along and makes it worth it, I guess. But I don't know. For most people, given the way things are going, that bump of cocaine, that little, the benefits that you see from kids really, 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 really are not enough to justify them for most people, which is why in the West, we're below replacement level in the terms of the number of kids people are having. People are having less than 2 kids per person, because, gosh, 1 kid, if you're going through the traditional rigmarole, yeah, it's going to be a difficult thing. Of course it's going to be a difficult thing because the system we have doesn't make any sense. The system we have, the only reason we think that the system we have is logical and makes sense is because our economic systems have pumped so much money into our society where we can afford to be a little stupid and we can afford to do things that aren't really, pragmatic and aren't really, philosophically and ethically and morally consistent, so we're living, this is an element, going back to the Japanese part, we do live in a very simulated reality because we're propped up by capital, by money. If we were living right on the edge, if everyone was living in absolute poverty, if we decided to do something crazy like, oh yeah, we're going to just send kids to school for, for 12 years and you're going to have to pay, like $500,000 for every kid. And, you're going to also have to spend a lot of time just, pampering them and making sure they do their homework, which doesn't give you back any money. Like if you had one person who did that, who lived like a modern person in absolute poverty versus someone who lived like someone in absolute poverty, only one of them would survive. The person who is living like a modern person would die. It would be ridiculous. But because we have more money, we think, for some bizarre reason that we can live by a different set of rules and a different standard, that we don't need to be pragmatic, that we can, live in some simulated fantasy land. And yes, we can. We can do that. We can live by principles that don't really make sense, that are kind of crazy, but we can only do it for a short time. And this is what the modern day is showing the entire world. Because it works for a very short time, but then the seams start tearing apart and, the fabric starts unraveling. And then you have, your system basically fall apart. It doesn't need to be it's a huge collapse, it's a civil war, blah, blah, blah. No, it's just, it's just like the Soviet Union's collapse, for example. In the modern day, the collapse is going to be like, the population collapse, right? Our system does not work. Our system really does not work, It could have worked maybe if you had a parent in the home and a parent working, you maybe could have afforded, spending a little bit more time on your kids like that. But now, no, it's like, you really started seeing the population, start tanking during the Gen X period and beyond. The boomers kids are less than the Gen Xers kids, I think. Or the millennials. Anyway. But the point is, the population has been basically going down since the 70s or so. And I said this perfectly coincides with the Cultural Revolution in the West. And, well, and I don't think the Cultural Revolution in the West was the only nail in the coffin, but I think it was the final nail. I think, if you had a system where you had, some, kids go to school and then their parents, one parent stays at home and one parent works, kind of like a pre-1965 kind of ideal, that could have kind of worked. But even that, I think, would have, I feel like that's not sustainable either. And anyway, so here's my point. Here is my point. And before I get to the point, if you think that any of this stuff is this is so bigoted, this is so evil, why do you say this? This is terrible. It's like, okay, if you're going to say that, then give me an alternative model that makes sense and that works. Because right now, the entire world is going into a very dark direction. And if we don't fix it, then the happy little standard of living that you enjoy might not be sustainable. Because one of the reasons why having a lot of people is an important thing is because the more people you have, the more Einsteins you have. The more Richard Feynmans, the more, geniuses that exist in your population. And geniuses push forward society. You don't really have much progress unless you have, some really big geniuses who fundamentally have paradigm shifts on how society is supposed to work and how, different elements of our understanding of reality work. I mean, that's an important thing. It's not everything, but it's an important thing. The more people you have, the more labor you have. The more labor you have, the more economic progress you can make. So, and the idea that, we need to cap the number of people who live here. It's like, no, there's so much land that hasn't been, how would you say it? Colonized yet. There's so much, we're using everything very inefficiently. We can be a lot more efficient with how we do everything. And we can probably do it extremely sustainably too. It's like, I don't know, like the Malthusian environmentalists, they don't really you can't just buy their narrative. Their narrative is false. You need it. The reality of the situation is a lot more complex and nuanced. And the idea that, we need to keep our population at a certain number. It's like, that's a stupid idea. Maybe we shouldn't have, a runoff exponential, but we also shouldn't, say, we're going to just cap it, or, we should make it really slow. I think the more people we have, the better human civilization will be. So anyway, let's get to the point. I think the future of human civilization will require us to have a positive population growth again. And a positive population growth that isn't just, 2.1 kids, but, something that you see in some parts of Africa, or something that you saw in, Europe during the 1800s, where people were having, 10 kids or whatever. Maybe it doesn't even be 10 kids, but, a lot of kids, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, blah, 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 right? And I think the only way that will happen, the only way that you'll have a system like that work, is if you find a way for kids to make their parents money in some way. If you can have kids provide a monetary benefit to their parents instead of being a total monetary drain for basically their entire lives. You have a kid, they take a lot of your money, and then they move out, and you'll probably never see any more money from them again until maybe you retire, or you get dementia or something, and someone needs to take care of you, and then they pay for that. But that's about it. It's not a very good. The current system, no matter how you really slice it, doesn't really have a good economics for having kids. But if you have a system where, where there's now some, value in your kids, your kids help you out, well, that's a system where people are probably going to want to have more kids. And as someone who wants to start a business, it's kind of hard to, especially if you don't really have much money, it's kind of hard to pay someone to help you out with something. Getting labor is a hard thing, but it's necessary. You need labor to do stuff, or else you're just going to, labor is a force multiplier. And if your kids, for basically no effort, I had sex and now I have a kid, for kind of low, and it's not completely low effort. Your wife is kind of incapacitated, she's pregnant, she's in pain and whatever. But, it's not zero effort, but it's not like, I need to pay for like a new car, or I need to pay for like it's not like $10,000 worth of effort to have a new kid. Essentially, it doesn't necessarily need to be like that. But anyway, if you can have a system where if we're having kids makes monetary sense, and having kids is actually like the smart money move to do, then people are going to have kids. And what does this look like? Let's look at the past. In the past, maybe you had, kids riding on a bike doing, how would you say it? Paper runs where they were throwing newspapers to all the houses. Maybe you could have kids basically operate in simple jobs like that. Maybe you could give them different jobs. Maybe they're going to be cashiers. Maybe they could do just, simple sanitation jobs. Maybe they could do this. Maybe there's a lot of different, maybe, hired jobs that they could do, that really wouldn't be bad for kids to do. It's not I really don't see a problem with that. I think that it's kind of absurd. What you'd have to say, where's the problem lie? Like, the problem in factory child labor is that you need to be pretty smart to run a machine. And if you don't run a machine correctly, if I put my finger in the wrong spot, then your arm gets ripped off and you die, right? So having a kid in that environment is not acceptable, But, having a kid where they're just biking around, throwing newspapers, like, where's really the risk? Now, the risk kind of in the modern day, it lies in the fact that we don't have very much community trust. And, well, there's a few things to that. And you could say that, there's maybe there's a reason why we shouldn't trust people in our community. Fair enough. But maybe that's kind of illogical. So I think that we need a debate as a society on that. We need to figure out, I kind of have ideas of why we don't really have much community trust, but I think we need to solve that problem too, because it's important. And it's linked to this. But anyway, so there's one idea. You could have kids working on hired jobs. Maybe your kids could be an apprentice to somebody. They could do, basic stuff. Maybe kids could be maids. Maybe kids could be, gosh, every once in a while, as time goes on, my house ends up getting more and more cluttered. What if I just got a kid to, what if I could hire a kid for $25 or whatever? Hey, every once a month, I want you to just come in, clean my entire house, and then leave, or something like that. Which maybe they don't even need to do a cleaning, where they use the mops and all that other stuff. What if they just organize it? Which I don't think would be that difficult for a kid. Being a janitor, it's a little more high intelligence necessary, and the likelihood a kid is going to do a really good job with that is kind of lower. But anyway, and then there's an idea of what if kids could help out in the actual, how would you say it, labor area. And what I mean by labor would be something where you're actually, it's not a support job, but it's an actual creation job where you're generating something new. And maybe this could be kids are working in, on safe, maybe safe type of machines, like let's say 3D printing. 3D printing seems to me to be a pretty low stakes, low risk type of thing. You push a button, the thing works. Maybe the kid would just watch the 3D print, make sure it doesn't, get screwed up. And then, if it does get screwed up, they push another button. That's something, it's a simple thing. Having kids to help out with that could be helpful and safe. Maybe you could have factories that, instead of, being, something, kind of in, having the dangerous and, unsanitary conditions of places in the past. But if you had a factory system that is more geared to being very simple and very safe, kind of like a modern factory, kind of, I don't know, maybe there could be a place there, and I don't know, you might have an emotional gut reaction to that, saying, oh, that's terrible. It's like, I don't know, why is that terrible? Like it was terrible then because it was unsafe. You had children in the mines getting black lung and all this stuff. Like we didn't realize, I think, as a society, how what risks technology posed. But we also, I don't know, I think we were also so poor that we couldn't really afford to be safer with everything. We couldn't afford to, do things in a more, step back a second, think about what we're doing, and then say, okay, well, maybe we need to improve this stuff. We just kind of had to jump in and say, okay, we have to do this. Because if I don't do that, imagine a family who's like starving, who has like, a bunch of kids, and they live in a city, so they can't really, do subsistence farming. It's like, what are they going to do? Oh, well, gosh, I mean, either my family starves or I send my kid to a mine. Like, I mean, it seems like it's a terrible decision to make. Why would you do that? It's like, if you're in that situation, maybe it's a decision you have to make, or else you all die. And maybe it's not that, I don't know. I think we really got to empathize with people in the past, because if we don't, then we're just stupid. And I think modern people really don't empathize with people in the past, which is a huge problem. Anyway. They could work factory jobs. I don't know. Or maybe they just work around the house. Maybe having kids, they just make sure that your entire home is like a, how would you say it? Working like a well-oiled machine. Like it's like a ship, a Navy ship, where everything is in their place, everything is working. Excuse me. You get home as the father. You've been working a really long day, and you come in, everything's in its place, everything's working. You have food going, blah blah blah. Maybe kids could cook food. Maybe I don't know. There's a lot of things a kid could do around the house too. Maybe we could also go back to subsistence farming, right? What if we went into hydroponics? Because I'm thinking like we'd have to make this a system that works for people, and maybe cities. This is a system that would have to work for people in cramped areas and blah, 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 and whatever. And maybe, hydroponics or like some sort of, farming that you can perform in like a small enclosed area. Maybe that's how we can have kids work. They could sustain or they can maintain the systems that we have for something like that. And we could save money at the same time and, decentralize our the means of production, the means of agriculture. Anyway, there's, at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of things that could be done here. There's a lot of things that kids could do. And I think the idea that a kid should just go to school, it's kind of I don't think it's been completely thought through. And I think the results of it have been the global collapse of our population, which is going to lead to really bad consequences. And it will take us probably decades, if not a century, to get over the effects of what's going to happen. But I think that with modern technology, with all we know historically, I think that we could both educate kids, we could have them provide us economic benefit, and we could, basically shape them into great people for the future that can engage in an industrialized technological society properly, at the same time, because one of the reasons why education has been so prioritized above literally everything else is because we've learned that, science and technology have been able to provide us with so much practical benefit. And, there's a lot of stuff to learn with all this stuff, right? So people have said, oh, well, let's just focus on that, right? The issue is, I think the big assumption that has been made without much justification is, kids need to be in school for 8 hours a day. Kids need to, we need to, it needs to be their full sole focus. It's like, I don't know. I don't think so. The reason why schools are that long is because so that they can operate as daycares, so parents don't need to worry about their kids for 8 hours, 12 hours, whatever. But I don't know. Why does it need to be 8 hours? Why can't we make it 4 hours? Why can't we make it 2 hours? I think that we could probably make this way more efficient. I think we could probably use our modern technology and computing abilities to make it way more efficient. And maybe we could have them learn while they're working or whatever. Anyway, the point is there's so many different ways that we can get around this issue. There's so many ways we can, kill two birds with one stone here, that I think it's kind of ridiculous to say that it's, not a feasible idea, and that we need to prioritize education. It's like we can prioritize both. The first thing one of the main lessons in engineering is if you think you know how to do something, then you probably haven't thought about it enough. Like, oh, yeah, in order to solve this problem, we need to do this. It's like, are you sure we need to do it that way? There's probably 5-10 counterintuitive ways that you haven't thought of that are probably going to do it way better than the first idea that you just had. The first idea that humanity just had is, child labor isn't a thing anymore. Now let's just prioritize education. It's more complicated than that, obviously, but I think that it hasn't been fully thought out. And the reason it hasn't been fully thought out is because the modern educational system and project are kind of results of the state. And the things that the state decides to do aren't very logical, and they're kind of, only a couple people decide what the state does, which is really inefficient and really stupid, honestly. But what the market decides, what entire social civilizations decide, that pools the collective intelligence and knowledge of, millions, if not billions of people. And that's what we should listen to. We should listen to, the wisdom of what a society says rather than what a state says is going to be the right thing. Because the society, a market, the voice of the actual people, in the form of like some sort of, insane supercomputer of humanity, that's going to give you a much better option or much better answer to the problems that we face than, a few politicians. A billion people is always going to be smarter than 200 people, in my humble opinion. Anyway, so those are the thoughts. Those are the ideas. Let me know what you think. But I don't know. My prediction is that, well, here's my prediction. You're probably going to see a lot of Malthusian environmentalists die off over the next half a century. And the only people who are going to have kids are people who are conservative. And maybe that's also due to the fact that there's religious reasons for it, but there's also economic reasons, because conservatives tend to be rural, and if you're rural, then the likelihood that your children are going to be helping you on a farm or something like that is a lot higher, so there's an economic reason for the kids. So anyway, that's probably what you're going to see. You're going to see, the kind of the leftist Malthusian types in cities dying off, and then the conservative, people who are having kids are going to get higher. And then maybe our society will figure out, the people who are still around and who are now the dominant group, the conservative people, maybe they'll start realizing, oh, you know what, we should probably live in some sort of, a non kind of, metropolitanized, urbanized life. We should probably be a little more decentralized. And in doing so, maybe that's how the power will kind of shift, and they'll probably live in a system that maybe, has an economic use for kids rather than, just an economic drain from kids. But I don't know. This is probably also one of the reasons why people in cities don't have any kids, because it's probably a lot harder to make money from your kids in a city than it is in a rural environment. Was it the philosopher Moldbug or something like that? I think he called cities brain shredders, and he explained that cities do a great job of decreasing the IQ of everybody in them because smart people don't have kids when they go into cities, and there's a lot of reasons for it, but this is probably one of them. But anyway, I think that there's a lot of truth in what I've said, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'd like to hear it from you guys if I'm wrong. But please share these ideas, talk with other people. We need to find a system that works, because the current models that are being kind of pushed by the modernist kind of the stupid intellectuals from the 60s are really, really, really dumb, really dumb models that are founded on some really shady and stupid principles. And the only way that we will destroy that model, the current ruling model that everyone basically believes in, is by proposing a much more coherent, much more, a model and a theory for society that makes a lot more sense. And in doing so, I think that in the evolutionary battlefield, if you have a model that works versus a model that's really ineffective and stupid, the model that works is going to win out. So I think it's incredibly important that any academic or intellectual who has good principles needs to do this, or else, well, we're going to be doomed as a society to some mediocre existence for a few decades before someone finally figures out the better move. But anyway, hopefully this didn't sound too pretentious. I'm just trying to say that, if you're a thinker, you can't just sit on your butt. You got to do something in the real world. And you can't keep your damn thoughts to yourself. You got to talk with other people, because talking is like, a neural network. It's connections between, nodes in this network. And that's how societies change, by talking, by changing minds, changing perspectives, and getting a more clear view of reality by talking with other people. So do that. If you don't do that, then you're wasting your life. Your life is defined by the people around you, by the connections that you have with people, and by your position in a network of others. So don't be complacent. Find a group of people and do your job.